Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful panel. I am joined by Jessie Smith here. It is not only my duty, but also my honor to be introducing her. Jessie Smith is a biochemist who started her brewing career at Houston's St. Arnold, where she focused on yeast health and propagation. She then became the quality manager at Single Cut Beersmiths in Clifton Park, New York, ensuring the quality of both single cut and contract beers from multiple brands. She is currently the owner of Queen City Quality, a lab testing service designed with New York State breweries in mind. It's all you.
Thank you. Everyone hear me okay? All right. Well, thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to give this talk because it's data I've been sitting on for a couple of years now. So I'm really excited to be able to share it, and hopefully you guys can take some useful London 3, London Ale, yeast uses from it. So we've got Wrangling London 3, and I feel like PowerPoint used to have the sounds, but they don't. So I'm gonna do that for every slide. Okay, so to start, I just wanna give a little background on myself, just to kind of show you I'm somewhat qualified to talk about yeast because it's kind of my favorite subject. So yeast health and experience. As Tony said, my first brewery job was at St. Arnold, a mid-sized brewery in Texas. I went to UB, studied biochemistry, didn't want to do a PhD, didn't want to do research, but I had a yeast research background. So I thought, okay, what industries might use this? And I fell into the brewing industry and fell in love with it. So that's when I started at St. Arnold's. Learned a lot. They have a great lab program. They're about 60 to 70,000 barrels a year, so fairly large and established. Again, great lab program, learned micro, but then also got to focus more on yeast health and propagation. So while I was there, worked with another brewer, helped set up a yeast propagation system using equipment that they already had in-house. So instead of buying a prop with agitators, which are wicked expensive, we kind of wanted to see, okay, can we propagate? Is this useful for our brewery with the equipment that we already have? And during that time, worked with juggling seven different yeast strains while working at that brewery. So learned to propagate them, all their different attributes, and London Ale or London 3 yeast was one of those. Okay, so you guys know all of this, but I just have to do the yeast basics just to give us a baseline. So propagation. This is growing up your own liquid yeast to the correct cell density instead of buying from a supplier, or buying a starter from a supplier and growing it to the size that you need. Pretty much just growing your own yeast. Harvesting is getting healthy yeast from the bottom of a fermenter or propagation vessel. So we've all seen this diagram. You've got your dead yeast at the bottom of your cone. That's what you want to kind of blow off before you start harvesting. You got your happy campers in the middle, and then you've got your poor flocculators at the top. With London Ale yeast, that's going to be a little different. We might have some good yeast at the top there. That's why the method I'm going to talk about is pretty useful for that. But in general, this is the kind of system you have set up when you're trying to harvest your yeast. And then flocculation, pretty much just how your yeast groups together, how the proteins kind of coagulate, and this natural ability of yeast to kind of stick together. So those are our basic principles. So what do you want from your brewer's yeast? Obviously you want it to make alcohol. That's why we're all here. You want it to make CO2, you want it to do all of its fermentation processes. But also, you want to be able to get as many generations out of your yeast as possible. So again, if you're buying liquid yeast, if you're buying that starter, those get expensive. It adds up really quickly. So you want to be able to use it instead of just one and done. You want to be able to get more generations out of it, so you get your money's worth. In addition, you want your yeast to maintain a consistent flavor. You don't want it to be fluctuating, giving some off flavors, giving stressed yeast flavors. You want it to be consistent because that follows through in your final beer, the consistency of your beer. You want to have fast fermentations. If your bottleneck is how many tanks you have, you want to get those in and out, and that could be determined by your yeast. If you've got slow fermentations, that could really be a bottleneck where you have issues down the line with packaging and logistics and things like that. And really, all of this starts from the propagation stages. Starting with your healthy yeast, and making sure it's good to go, it's healthy, and then you get all of these wonderful things from it. So I'm going to use interchangeably London Ale, London 3 yeast, kind of the same thing, so just a little history. The origins are actually kind of tricky to trace with London Ale yeast, but it's speculated that the strain originated from Boddington's brewery in the mid-1700s. So it's been around a while, and that's why it's called London Ale yeast, because that's where it originated from. And there's theories that the strain was stored by the company Whitbread. So pretty much it's been around a long time. But we've seen a resurgence with it with our New Englands and our hazy IPAs. So within the past 10 years, brewers are like, hey, this is a fantastic yeast strain for what I'm trying to do. I want a soft, smooth, fluffy mouthfeel. I want high flocculating yeast. It is a top cropping yeast strain, which I'll circle back to in a little bit, but it gives really nice, fruity, aromatic notes, and it's pretty hearty. It's got a medium to high alcohol tolerance. So if our New England IPAs are a little stronger, it's able to hold up with that. So yeah, for New England's, it's a tried and true strain. A lot of brewers use this. Actually, who uses London 3 or London Ale? So I'd say a good majority of you guys are familiar with it. I like to call it a problem child though. So I think of yeast as, how can we harvest it? How can we get the best possible yield out of it so that we can reuse it? So since London 3, London Ale is a top cropping yeast strain, that means it's gonna sit on the top. And sometimes it's called rafting. And like we said, it's a high flocculating strain. So it likes to stick together, but sometimes it'll stick together at the top. If you're trying to harvest from the bottom of your cone, like we saw with that earlier diagram, you're not gonna get it. You could have very healthy, happy yeast up there, sitting there, you'll never be able to obtain it. So that's why in some cases it's really difficult to harvest your London 3 yeast, depending on your brewery size. And that's just wasted yeast. Again, you're paying a lot of money for this. You want to make sure you're harvesting it and using that for your next batch. And then in addition, with hazy IPAs, you've usually got a dry hop stage, so you have a very small window where you can harvest that yeast. So if you miss that window, let's say that's your fresh pitch, that's it, you're done. No more generations from it. So it's tricky to navigate that dry hop stage. That's why this is our problem child. So I'm proposing propagate your yeast instead of trying to struggle with the headaches of harvesting it. And again, I'll get into some disclaimers. This isn't for every brewery. Depends on your size, your logistics, how often you're using London Ale yeast. But I'll show you a case study where this worked well for a brewery. So instead of trying to struggle with harvesting, struggling with that window after dry hopping, or before dry hopping, to try to get it, they implemented a regular propagation system in order to avoid harvesting that. And they were able to get higher generations out of their London Ale yeast from that as well. So as we mentioned before, London Ale is a high flocculator, so we need to look at, okay, what are the L3 traits that we can use to our advantage? Again, it's a high flocculator. We've got the trouble of it rafting and sitting on top, but we know it's there. We know it's sticking together well, so we can use that to our advantage. Again, medium to high alcohol tolerance, so it's a pretty hearty yeast strain, and it gets better with generations. There's some yeast strains where generation 4 or 5, they start to stall out, then they'll pick back up again. But L3, once it starts going and you're getting up in generations, it just kind of exponentially gets better, heartier, better flavors from it when given the proper growth conditions. That's important as well. So yes, as I said, improving with increasing generations, and it also has very quick growth and fermentation properties. So in general, fermentations can be really quick if you have healthy London Ale yeast, and then as I'll get into as well, if you're propagating it, it's very quick, pretty consistent, so it's very reliable when you're trying to propagate. As I mentioned, this isn't for every brewery. It's something you could grow into depending on your size, depending on your scheduling, your logistics. Let's say you're barely using London 3, you're only using it for your one specific beer that you brew every 2 weeks. This might not be the best solution for you. You'll have scheduling constraints with the method that I'm going to propose, just with the way that you need to use the yeast in a timely fashion. Because as we know, yeast in storage, it starts to lose its viability, off flavors, all those things can happen. It involves time to grow up the yeast. There will be a process of crashing the yeast so that you can get it to settle out. That all involves time and planning ahead for your scheduling. And then in addition, you'll also need dedicated vessels for this. You'll need your propagation vessel and storage vessel. So that's extra space, extra money if you don't already have all this stuff in place. Okay, so getting onto the case study. The brewery that I was working with was about 20,000 barrels per year, so pretty well established. They already had 3 dedicated propagation vessels. So they had 2 that were 15 barrels, 1 that was 30, full agitators, load cells, the whole shebang. So that was great for them. Not all breweries that size would even have those. Like I said, when I was at St. Arnold, 70,000 barrel brewery did not have propagation vessels. So they already had these in-house, ready to go, but they weren't being used properly. They weren't being used to their fullest. They were using 2 yeast strains consistently, but pretty much everything was London 3 or London Ale. So we were able to use that to our advantage, knowing, all right, every week we've got 4 or 5 beers that we're going to be pitching our London Ale yeast into. We're using it quite a bit. Let's see how we can make the most out of it. So going into their original propping method, like I said, they had 2 15-barrel prop vessels and a 30. So we're going to focus on the 15 barrels, those 2 separate ones. So they were propagating pretty regularly 15 barrels of yeast slurry. They would cold crash it. They would harvest this into keg brinks, like we have in this picture here. And they would pitch a certain number of kegs based on the batch size. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about their method with this diagram here. So we'd have the 2 15-barrel tanks. They'd pitch their yeast, their prop wort, any nutrients that they wanted to. They would let it grow. They'd let it sit over the weekend to grow. So that could be up to 48, 72 hours. Once they get growth, they would crash the tank for 5 to 6 days, letting that all settle out. They would drain off that supernatant, so just the useless wort that's left. That's what's indicated in yellow here. Drain off the supernatant, so you're left with a thick slurry on the bottom. And they would harvest this into keg brinks. These would be stored cold, and then, as I said, pitched tank to tank based on the tank size that they needed. So what was wrong with this method? First of all, they weren't looking at their malt COAs regularly. And as we all know, malt quality is a very fluctuating thing, especially 2020, 2019. There were some crazy fluctuations, and it's not going to stop. We're going to keep having those issues. So that's one of my big takeaways that I'll have at the end is look at your COAs, track that data, and learn from it and make adjustments from that. So they were using malt for their prop wort that really wasn't very robust. Not very high extract, diastatic power was lacking, so they were lacking yeast nutrients that propagating wort especially needs. You need all that stuff in fermentation, but when you're propagating, it's essential to have that good baseline for your yeast to grow. So in addition to that, they were lacking yeast nutrients. They weren't really adding a lot to this propagation wort, and again, your propagating yeast needs a lot more than your fermentation. They're little babies. They need help growing. So they weren't adding enough additional nutrients. The really big issue was they were letting their yeast props sit for too long. So they would start a propagation Friday afternoon. They wouldn't do any cell counts, wouldn't check on it, nothing until Monday. Now this could be fine for some yeast strains. Your lager strains, they could be totally cool to sit over the weekend. This is something I like to do with lactobacillus propping. It's super happy to sit over the weekend, set it, forget it. But with our London Ale yeast, it's got a very quick growth window. So they were getting cell death, essentially, at the end. They were missing that exponential growth phase and letting it sit too long. In addition, during all of this time, during the growth, they weren't checking the cell counts. They weren't really monitoring the yeast. It was kind of a set it and forget it thing. But then also, since they were doing keg brinks, they weren't able to check the cell count and viability before pitching. So it ended up in a pitching blind scenario. And again, some scenarios this worked okay. They'd have a good fermentation. But in general, they were going in blind with this. They weren't able to check the cell counts. They were pitching a lot of dead yeast, which resulted in a lot of under attenuations, low ABVs, just kind of across the board, that under attenuation sweetness in their IPAs. And as we'll go into, this is all stuff that's pretty easy to avoid once we get our new method going. So how this was hurting them. They'd buy a starter and they wouldn't be getting the most out of their yeast purchase. They're going through all the work of propagating the yeast and then letting it die off in that vessel. So again, doing the keg brink method, lots of underpitching was occurring. They're also pitching yeast that's in poor health. So we're getting those off flavors, we're getting that stressed out yeast. And they weren't able to ever kind of come back from that because they'd use those same keg brinks into their next propagation. So you just kind of keep that cycle of unhappy yeast going. So they were kind of just in, as soon as they got a starter, they'd start fresh, they'd be in this kind of tough cycle. But this is what they'd done for many years. So this is what they thought worked for them and what they were used to doing. So then I come in, new sheriff in town, we're gonna wrangle that yeast. So we're gonna make some changes. Thank you, I've been slacking on that. So changes to be made. Again, they had a good, I think it was 11 Plato starting wort. That's a good gravity for your London ale yeast, but it was lacking in those nutrients. So we used a different type of grain, something that was a little bit more robust, but then we also added additional nutrients. Zinc sulfate in particular. That's my favorite for propagating yeast. It's got everything they need. They love it. They go wild for it. And it's super simple. You just add one thing and you can do whatever you want. You can try different concentrations or different yeast nutrients, but having that good base of zinc sulfate I found is pretty crucial for propagating yeast. We're now checking our cell counts, our viabilities, gravity, and pH during propagation. So having a lab person in there, I like data, I like graphs, I like all that stuff. So I'm like, all right, we're gonna be doing this now. So every 4 hours since we start the propagation, we're gonna be doing that and we're gonna be tracking that data. And I'll show those graphs towards the end. One of the really big factors was strategic timing of the propagations. So we were only 2 shifts. We'd have a morning and afternoon shift. There could be times where the yeast is in their exponential growth phase when we want to crash it, and that could be overnight. So we shifted the propagation so that, okay, we'll start it at this time. I know by tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to do the cell counts. It should be ready to crash by then. So we're getting it in that window where it's really happy, where we're not hitting that cell death yet. So working with our schedule based on that. Using another vessel to hold the yeast cold. This one was super huge. Instead of using all those brinks, we could use them for storage if we had extra, but having a separate vessel to hold our yeast cold. And this happened to have load cells already, so we were able, an agitator, so we were able to mix it, able to weigh out the yeast, but we would do our propagation, and I'll show the diagram after, but store all the yeast there and then pull from that throughout the week with the correct amount of yeast that we needed for each brew, instead of keg brink, go, instead of doing it like that. And then the other big thing, counting before pitching. We couldn't access the counts in the keg brinks. With this vessel, we can pull, we can agitate, we can mix it up, we can pull a sample, get our count, put it in our calculator, and know exactly how much yeast we need to pitch. So here's the other version of our diagram, the better version. We're gonna have growth. We're gonna do our continuous cell counts. We're gonna track pH and gravity, viability as well. We're gonna look at all that and we're gonna let the yeast tell us when it's ready instead of fitting it into our schedule. So again, we've got that growth. And again, we're doing the 2 15 barrels side by side. So we're gonna crash. That's exactly the same, about 5 or 6 days. You wanna give it that time to settle out. Again, because with London 3, we might have that rafting yeast up there. If you give it a little more time, that will start to come down. So again, we've got that supernatant, And with their vessels, we did have it so that this is something you'd have to troubleshoot, but had it so that, okay, we know our yeast is here, we can drain off our supernatant here without using too much yeast slurry. But that's something to troubleshoot a little bit. And it's not perfect. You could get a little yeast slurry as you're draining off your supernatant as well. So then we've got two 15-barrel tanks full of really good, healthy, happy yeast slurry. We mix them up real good and then transfer them to that storage vessel. And that's kept cold. So then that storage vessel can be used to pitch our subsequent brews for that week. And again, we can count, we can mix, we can make sure we have enough yeast. And we would usually have surplus yeast for that brew. So then we could put those in the keg brinks for storage if, God forbid, something happened, or, we want to add an extra brew for the week, we do have some more yeast for that. All right, what to watch out for, specifically with London ale yeast. It's very fluffy, and it can spill out pretty easily. So my first London 3 propagation that I did while I was at my first brewery, when we're starting to practice all this, we'd done Conan propagations, we nailed that, they were doing great. We were pitching it into 240 barrel batches, fermenting in 3 days. I was like, cool, this is great. Let's move on to London ale yeast. Let's start propagating that. So I set up my propagation, it's good, and we knew we could have some time with it, so I let that one sit overnight. So I come in the morning, and all my London ale's on the floor, going right into the drain. I'm like, guys, what are you doing? I gave it a healthy, happy home, and it just didn't want to live anymore, wanted to spill out. So from there on, I call London 3 seppuku yeast, the Japanese ritualistic suicide. Just didn't want to live there anymore. So that's something super important, that firm cap to be added with any propagation you do, because it can't hurt. Firm cap really, at this stage, I haven't seen an effect on head retention. I'm sure some people don't like using firm cap or don't like using it at that point, but I think at this point, it really doesn't have a huge effect. It saves all your yeast, which I think is more important than having it spill out and having it ruin your day. Performing micro-testing at the end of your growth. So again, if we go back to this diagram, we're going to be using that yeast that's sitting in that vessel for multiple fermentations. We want to make sure it's clean. We've had some transfers. We've had 2 separate tanks. We want to make sure everything's good because we're going to be pitching that to multiple tanks. That could be 3 or 4 diastatic infections that we're spreading if, God forbid, our yeast slurry is infected. And the nice thing is, you've got those, if you're able to take it at your, what I'll call the completion stage, when it's done growing, right as you're about to crash it, then you've got 5 or 6 days for your micro results to come back. So that gives you plenty of time. All right, we have diastatic or somehow we have lacto infection. All right, we're not going to use those. We're not going to pitch them to our next vessel. And I think most yeast supply companies, they do this as well. They're doing those micro tests before they send out the yeast to you. So you do it on your own as well. Okay, before I get into the data, we're getting close. What are the benefits of this? Obviously, you've got that consistent yeast supply. It's something that you can rely on. Once you get in the groove of it, it's pretty foolproof. Obviously things can go wrong, but you've got that consistent supply. In addition, you're able to get up to higher generations because you're keeping that train going. You're pitching good yeast, and you're using that same yeast for your next propagation. So previously, this brewery would get to 4 or 5 generations, and they'd be done. They'd have to buy a new starter. Now, I think they can get to 13, 14. They can really get their money's worth out of their yeast starter. The other cool thing that we started to see from this was we were artificially selecting for the better flocculators. So as we're using that same yeast to the next propagation, to the next, we're kind of selecting for those good flocculators, the ones that are coming down quicker, and then they're going into the next propagation, into the next fermentation, all of that. So we were really kind of seeing an exponential increase in our density and what we were getting from our yeast and our yeast health. And then as generations increased, you're getting better and better harvests from your propagation vessel. Okay, cons of this method. Obviously, it involves a decent amount of waiting. You're waiting for your propagation to grow. You're waiting for those tanks to crash. Sometimes you might not have that time. You might be like, hey, I need the yeast now. I know I can get it from my yeast supplier, they can overnight it, or I'm in the area, I can pick it up from them. This involves a lot of planning ahead. So that's why I said before, not necessarily for every brewery. You need to be able to plan this and use London 3 in a way that you are doing this frequently enough. So you need that time to cold crash, and like I said, need to schedule it so that you're using up that yeast before it starts to die off in your storage vessel. In addition, you need a storage vessel. Instead of doing keg brinks, you want to have something that you can pull from for your subsequent pitches throughout the week. And then real quick, some other options. So let's say you didn't want to do the multiple pitches, depending on your brewery size, your prop size, you could pitch the full prop into your tank for one fermentation. The trouble with that is you want to be able to use that again. So that would involve harvesting. So let's say you like the propagation idea, but you're not going to be able to do it back to back, use it for multiple pitches, pitch the full thing, but then you have to implement harvesting. The good thing is you're starting with really healthy yeast because you've done the propagation, you've done it right, all the nutrients from the get-go. It might be easier to harvest. But again, we're doing our New Englands. You need to harvest before that dry hop. That can be a short window, that can be tricky timing, logistics. You can come up with a brand specifically that delays the dry hop or doesn't have the dry hop using the London 3 yeast. Brewery that I worked at, that was something that they did. They're like, here's our specific brand. It didn't last, but it was a good idea in theory. But here's our specific brand that uses London yeast that doesn't have a dry hop. Once we get it propagated, we get harvest from that. But again, that's kind of tricky. And yeah, scheduling it so you're able to continue your harvest train if you're doing this method. Again, you want to be able to get the most bang for your buck. Continue that harvesting. Once you're at the point where you're using this liquid yeast, you've got the starter. We want to keep it going as long as possible. Okay, now we're in the graphs. So growth curves. So this we have, it's kind of fuzzy in this one, but we've got our cell count on the side here, cells per milliliter. On the bottom we have our hours. Yeah, it's a little fuzzy. Okay, so with one of the first things I did with this brewery was starting to track their cell counts with their propagations. This is something they weren't even looking at. So that's the first baseline. And for any yeast strain that you're doing this with, you want to see, okay, how is this yeast growing? What's its general pattern? And creating an average curve. So this black line, this dotted black line, is our average curve for our London propagations. We do have a bit of a strange start. So normally what I would see for a yeast propagation, we'd start slow, we'd have our lag phase, we'd go up a little bit, exponential, and then we can kind of see it here. It dies off. So we don't see the lag phase in this diagram with the way we strategically planned our props. So the lag phase would be overnight, so that by the time I came in the morning, all right, we're right about here. It's almost ready to crash. We're almost at our exponential growth phase. We're almost at our target cell count that we want. So that's this line here. We've got our target cell count of 100 million cells. So that's what we want to have at a minimum for before we start crashing it. For our London ale yeast, that's what we want to see during that completion stage. So then once we get, I would say maybe 5 or 6 of those propagations, that's when you create this average curve. And again, it can be a little wonky. There's, we got some weird points here. Every propagation is different, but this gives you a baseline of, okay, I'm at 14 hours and I'm all the way down here. Something's wrong. It's not going to get to the point I need it to quickly enough. Do I need to scrap this, start over? It just gives you that baseline of, are we on the right track? Is something wrong? So then you can add in your individual yeast propagations. So again, we were doing 2 15-barrel tanks side by side. We can see they were pretty consistent. Getting good growth and then getting far past the target cell count that we wanted. So for reference, we saw between 18 and about 24 hours was that good exponential growth for London 3. So that's not that long at all. Of course, lager yeast, it takes a couple days for it to grow up, but London is a quick grower. So that's kind of the shorter step for all of this propagation. So, more graphs. I think it's really important to track the gravity as well. So you can have your cell counts, but the gravity is also a really good indicator. Is this propagation going the right way? Is the gravity going down in the average way that we would see? And again, same type of graph, hours, gravity in Plato, and then we were tracking our 2 propagations compared to our average. And again, they're going down, they're pretty darn close. If this one's way up here, I'll say, okay, something's wrong. Either we didn't even pitch the yeast, it's missing the yeast altogether, or something, there's an infection, something else took over. It kind of gives us those indicators. And one more graph. Well, actually, no, there's 2 more after that. But one more tracking graph. We have our pH curves. So again, hours on the bottom, pH. This is also why you want to do that micro testing at the end. Yeast propagation can get down to 3.7. It can get lower than that. That's where yeast is healthy, happy. With those low pHs, if you have a lacto infection, you're not going to see it with a pH reading because your pH is already so low. So that's why we do the micro testing. But this is a whole other talk I could give about pH being an indicator of yeast health. Besides doing, if you're not able to do cell counts and viability, doing pH readings on your fermentations, as soon as you pitch your yeast, that can tell you how your fermentation is going to go. It can tell you, all right, and again, making those average curves, it can tell you, all right, this is going to be like 4 days till close, 7 days till crash, just based on your starting pH. So that's something with both the gravity and pH curves that you should be tracking in your fermentation as well, because this data is invaluable. It can really help you, especially if your bottleneck are your fermenters, like, hey, I've got beer in here, I need to get another beer in as quickly as possible. Shortening those windows of fermentation is super important. So that's my TED Talk on why you should be graphing. And it's Excel, it's easy, it's fun, I just love it. Okay, so now completion graphs. So as I said before, completion is when we were in our exponential growth phase, where we've hit our 100 million. That was our target. So then we would crash the tanks. So completion is that step. So we've got our dark blue. This is when I started tracking the cell counts before we made any changes. So before this was not even tracking them. Here we're still doing the keg brinks, but testing after we pitch them, so we're able to kind of get that completion. But then we also have the target in here. So this is before any changes. So the changes that we made, again, we're adding those yeast nutrients. We're not letting them sit for too long. We're monitoring. We're doing all that stuff. We're starting to see a big change in hitting our target cell count for completion. So at the end of our propagation, we're seeing as much yeast as we need and more. So we're hitting that target much more often than we were here. It was just that kind of constant low level, not enough yeast. And then making those changes made a huge difference. Of course, you're gonna have outliers. Things happen, your glycol can get messed up, anything can happen. So then being aware of this, with this case, we didn't use these for the next pitch. We still had a keg in storage from the previous propagation that did well. We'll pop that over and we'll use that one instead. So kind of just being aware of, all right, we did have an outlier, something happened. We'll still be able to use these for fermentation, but we're gonna skip over those when it comes to the next generation. And then two, also being aware of, okay, listening to your yeast. I think it was around here. All right, we're starting to, we saw these outliers. We're gonna do a new pitch. We're starting to decline a little. So then here, our early generations again. So just, again, listening to your yeast and seeing, okay, we're starting to see a decline. Let's start fresh. But being able to get a lot more out of it than you were able to before. So then the big graphs, the harvesting graph. Again, we've got our cells per milliliter on the side, and then just the different props. So our target for harvesting is 500 million. So again, the yellows before any big changes. We're hitting it sometimes, but there's definitely some really low ones. And in that case, we barely have enough yeast to get by for the week. We're seeing a lot of under attenuation, a lot of low ABVs, things stalling out, just in general, just stressful too, in general, where you're like, okay, I don't know if I'm gonna have enough yeast for this week. Where then making those changes, we would have an overabundance of it. So it's just that kind of peace of mind as well that, all right, I have plenty of yeast, I can put some in storage, I can dump some if I don't need it, or versus this beginning where it's like, all right, we don't know if we're gonna get through the week with our yeast. In this case, hitting your target, and again, we've got some outliers, things happen, but having that overabundance makes a huge difference. And then two, if you're, nice to your friends in your area, you can share that yeast with them or sell it to them if you don't like them that much. But having that overabundance, just puts you in a more comfortable spot. And then again, we were listening to the yeast here. I think it's right here we started a new generation. So we could see, all right, we might be having some decline here. I think we got up to 13 generations. So this was a fresh starter. So you might have a little bit of a slow start, but then after that, I would expect this to go up just like that. Yes?
Do you track mutations as well in terms of your future, refeedings and so on and so forth with generations?
Mutations?
Yeah, like following the yeast strain decline in a certain way or improve based on feedings?
It'd be kind of tough to track the mutations because you would need genetic analysis, right? But I think again, it's listening to the yeast. If there are mutations that you're not able to see genetically, or you're able to see like, okay, we're getting this off flavor. Is that what you're kind of saying?
Meaning just like almost fundamentally using it for the same beer consistently and seeing it change. And then we've sent some stuff out to get tested and seen that we've had mutations based on feeding the same strain of yeast that we've got multiple generations. And that's when we didn't see a change in attenuation, so to say,
Gotcha.
because we fed it so frequently. So just a thought. Sorry.
And yeah, that would be genetic analysis. So you'd either have to do that testing regularly or have the inkling, okay, I wonder if we're getting some mutations happening here. But I think the real indicator is your beer consistency. If you're still happy with the flavors and everything, then kind of keeping that going until you're ready to stop again. Or you can do the mutation tracking and see what you have really going on. Is there, yes?
Do you ever lose count when you're tracking your counting data yourselves? And what do you do to lose count?
Like when you're doing the cell counting?
100 million. That's a big number.
I know. So I don't have it on this presentation, but I have a whole method for cell counting, and again, more spreadsheets, with data tracking that, but really you're only counting a certain volume, and you've got a little ticker counter, and then you do a calculation to extrapolate how many cells you have. So you're not counting 100 million. That would be...
Like Lem's website has it.
Yes. And then too, the ASBC just came out with a spreadsheet where you can put in your data and you can kind of keep track of those cell counts.
There's a talk on Friday at 2 p.m. about propagating and cell counts.
Perfect.
There you go.
So we'll all be there.
Question: when you say crashing, what temp do you go down to? Because when we do our crops, we only go down to 40.
Okay.
Just for fear of, you know what I mean? The stuff on the sidewalls.
Yes.
Like potentially freezing and bursting and stuff.
So with this particular brewery, we did have some fluctuating glycol issues. So I think we would usually crash to 36 with the indication that it might get down to 30. But if you're able to consistently, I think 32 is pretty good. If you're
agitating at that time as well, or do these tanks not have agitation?
The tanks did have agitation, but during the crashing we wouldn't because we wanted to keep that supernatant separate. So yes, there is the potential for freezing, but if you know your glycol, if you're tuned in with it, but again, that's what we did at this brewery.
Ours, the temp probes at the bottom, so
Yes.
it's packed full of yeast, so that it's kind of...
Yeah, so you can be on the safer side Because yes, that might be where some of these outliers are coming from too, where the glycol just dropped. You know, we had it set at 36, dropped to 29 or something. It's like, oh, sorry guys, that sucks. So yeah, knowing your system and all of that. But yeah, it's better to err on the side of caution. Yes.
Yeah, so in addition to zinc, something that yeast needs in order to get a good propagation is the right amount of oxygen. Are these all just oxygenated at the beginning of the process, or do you experiment with subsequent oxidation or oxygenation?
So I didn't mention that at all. Thank you for bringing that up. When I was working at St. Arnold and we were doing those propagations, we would just have a 6-barrel tank, a pump, and oxygen tanks. So I've done both continuous oxygen, and then we eventually got onto a timer where we have a burst at the beginning of every hour. I can't remember exactly what we did with this case study. It might have been the burst method, but doing the continuous oxygen, that's overkill. You really don't, and you can start to get some oxidation and things like that. So doing that burst, beginning of the hour, and again, depends on your yeast strain, factoring it in, but that's really all you need for that.
So for these,
Yes.
this is showing oxygen at the beginning and then bursts every hour. Like what's your oxygen protocol?
I can't remember exactly with this one. I'm pretty sure it was burst throughout. So yes, oxygen when it was all pitched, and then in addition, oxygen when you're going into your fermentation. And the other method too, this kind of starts to get more to the fermentation side, but when you have propagated yeast, if you're splitting, let's say you've got a 50 and a 50 into your 100 tank, splitting them so they're, you know, a little bit of time apart, giving that yeast some time to grow in the beginning, lots of oxygen, giving it time to grow, and then pitching more wort on top of it can really help with propagating yeast when you're starting to do fermentations with that.
So the oxygen thing, that was, what's his name from Allegan?
Yes.
Manager. I had spoke to him when we started our crop.
Yeah.
He instead do 1 liter per minute for 10 minutes every hour.
Yes.
And then once you see the Play-Doh drop below, yeast strain dependent, whatever you're looking for, then kill your oxygen and start bringing your temp down is what.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we follow as well.
And I think, we had talked to him as well. We were doing the continuous oxygen. He's like, you guys are dumb. You're just wasting, we're blowing through tanks. And I'm like, and yes, that's definitely the best way to do it.
So there's all this fluctuation, right, over the generations and everything like that. So I guess like the simplest way to ask my question is like, how stubborn should you be about this, right? Like, if you see these fluctuations down, like a slow fermentation or whatever, how much stick-to-itiveness should you have about continuing the harvest versus like just starting over again?
It depends on, again, it depends. It depends on your yeast strain. And I think too, that's why getting all of this data and tracking it helps you really be in tune with your yeast. So it's, kind of like a relationship, seeing like, okay, you know what? We did have an outlier with this, but I know that I can still get 3 more generations out of this London. Or it's like, you know what? We see it, we know that, all right, we have one bad one, it's gonna start to go down. So it takes a little bit of time to kind of get familiar with that. But again, depends on the yeast strain, depends on a lot of things. Yes?
So first of all, thank you for teaching me the word supernatant. For that. Given a brewery the lack of a tank with a built-in agitator, would you find a pump recirculating within a tank to be adequate agitation during propagation?
Yep, that's what we did at St. Arnold's, a 6-barrel tank. And it was kind of our proof of concept. Can we buy a propagation tank? So using a pump and then that oxygen and having temperature control.
Follow-up, given if you only had a flat bottoms tank to do your propagations, how would you reasonably get that yeast out of the tank?
Well, you got me there. Super slow. What you have on the very bottom, in theory, should be super concentrated. So maybe adding a little bit of wort in there to kind of mix it up. Does anyone have a better answer? just try your hardest. I don't know. Yeah, follow your heart. I don't. Anyone else? Okay, I've just got a couple more slides, but that was great. Thank you for those questions. Okay, so your long-term benefits from this. Like I said before, the really cool thing that we didn't realize we were doing was artificially selecting for those better flocculators of our London ale yeast. Those ones that are starting to settle at the bottom, and we're just, reusing them. And again, we can have some of that mutation happening there, but we wouldn't know it unless we're doing genetic testing. But that is something to, think about and be aware of. You're saving boatloads of money, and especially when you're doing liquid yeast. That's expensive. So being able to reuse it as much as possible gets you the most bang for your buck. You're getting more consistent fermentations because your yeast is healthy from the get-go. Again, you're starting with that zinc, you're starting with those nutrients, that oxygen. You're healthy from the get-go. Once you go to the fermentation stage, and again, fermentation, you want your oxygen in the beginning, you want your nutrients, your recipe development, that you're gonna have a healthy fermentation. But starting with healthy yeast gives you a better foot to stand on for the beginning. And then it helps with brew and packaging planning. Again, if you're at the point where, hey, I've got 2 fermentation vessels, I'm waiting for this to ferment, but I could have another beer in there and package more and get it all out, having that better turnaround and being able to plan this with the more consistent fermentations makes a huge difference when you're really starting to get going. So then, some takeaways. If you're struggling with harvesting your yeast, look at other options. See if, okay, maybe this is our time to make that jump to propagation. This could be really good for us. Check your COAs. And this doesn't just apply to propagation. This is all malt quality. If you're starting to see trends under attenuations, because not all malt suppliers will tell you. They'll kind of fake the data a little bit if they're getting poor malt quality. And as I said before, it's not going to end. We're having so many environmental issues. Malt quality is going to be an issue for time coming. So check those COAs and track them. Track your propagations as well. Track those cell counts, that viability. Just have a good starting point of data that you can look back on. And this applies to fermentations as well. It does take time to do all of that, but it's worth it once you're able to analyze it and quickly look back at things. Doing your cell counts, gravity, pH, viability. Again, this stuff takes time. And especially during your propagation, your busy brew day, you don't have a lab tech to do all of this for you, but it makes a huge difference when you're looking at these propagations and trying to determine, okay, when do I crash this tank so that I can get the most out of it? And then kind of back to the COAs, adjusting your nutrients, your prop wort, depending on your yeast strain, your propagation, whatever you're looking to do. So that's kind of it. Thank you guys. Any more questions? Yes.
So can you talk about the 2 options of crashing it at the exponential growth phase and giving it 5 days to settle out and discarding the supernatant, or would you do that as well if you're doing a multi-stage prop, or would you just dump the whole thing in at the exponential growth phase?
So it depends on what you're using it for. This is a good example. Being at St. Arnold's, we would be doing a 6-barrel prop, pitching into a 240-barrel tank. So we would pitch that entire vessel. And again, we'd do the splitting time. We'd let it sit. We do the oxygen, extra nutrients, all of those things for that. But yes, it would be one propagation into a full tank. With this method worked for this brewery because we were crashing it. And then it was such a concentrated slurry that we were able to so in that case, it would be okay, if you're going to take the time to crash it, have it go to multiple vessels. Was that kind of what you were asking about? Okay, so you've got some options. And you could also, I guess if you're taking the time to crash it, you want to get the most out of it, multiple fermentations. All right. Thank you.